Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Thomas Sowell has studied and taught economics, intellectual history, and social policy at institutions that include Cornell, UCLA, and Amherst. Now a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, Dr. Sowell has published more than a dozen books, many more than a dozen books, actually. I was just too lazy to count them all up. The one with which we will concern ourselves today, his classic work, first published in 1987 and then republished last year, A Conflict of Visions. Segment 1, The Two Visions. Let me quote from A Conflict of Visions. Quote, "When interests are at stake, the parties directly affected usually understand what the issue is. However, when there is a conflict of visions, those most powerfully affected by a particular vision may be the least aware of its underlying assumptions." Explain that distinction between interests and visions.
Oh, interests are articulated. The people who have particular interest know what they are and know what they're trying to do.
If you're a farmer in Iowa, you want the ethanol subsidy
That's
because
it.
you'll get a higher price for your corn.
Absolutely.
All right.
All right. With visions, it's different. These are the implicit assumptions with which you operate. You may not articulate them even to yourself, but you're assuming certain things when you talk or when you think. And seldom are those things spelled out.
Now, in A Conflict of Visions, you talk about two fundamentally differing visions.
Mm-hmm.
And these two fundamental visions underlie an enormous amount of the Western political tradition.
Yes.
The constrained vision and the unconstrained vision. Let me take a stab at a tight definition of each, and then you correct it for me. Under the constrained vision, an exemplar would be Adam Smith.
Yes.
Human nature is flawed, but it's fixed. Mm-hmm. And the question is, how do we erect institutions that contain our flaws and permit us to live in the best possible society, given in effect the fallen nature of, or the fallen character of human nature? Fair?
Yes, absolutely.
So when you say constrained, it's a vision of human nature itself. Human nature is fixed, flawed, and therefore we operate within constraints, the constraints human nature itself provides. Unconstrained is human nature itself is malleable, and you say that Rousseau, man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. That's the classic statement of the unconstrained vision. Would you explain that?
Yes, that the things that we suffer, according to those with the unconstrained visions, it's because of the failure of other people to be as wise or as noble as themselves, because there are no inherent reasons for us to be unhappy.
So one looks at pain and difficulty in the world and says, well, this is the way life is. Mm-hmm. We'll never eliminate it. Let's be wise and prudent and erect institutions that make life as much better as possible. That's constrained.
Yes.
The unconstrained vision looks at pain and suffering and says we must remake the world. There are institutions causing this pain and suffering.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Now, let me give you another quotation. The two great revolutions in the 18th century in France and in America can be viewed as applications of these differing visions. Explain that one.
Well, in France, the idea was that if you simply put the right people in charge and created the right institutions, then all these problems would go away. In the United States, it was assumed from the outset that there were very limited things you could do, and what you needed to do above all was to minimize the damage done by the flaws of human nature. And this is why the United States, for example, has this Constitution, so much lamented by some of those who believe in the French Revolution, in which this group is offset by that group, and nobody can sort of run wild. If you believe that what you need is to have the right leaders who love the people and so on, a messiah, as it were, then your problems are solved. But if you don't believe there is any political messiah, and you believe that you have to make sure that all people are restrained in what they are able to do, then you have the separation of powers, you have elections, you have constitutions, you have all kinds of things hemming you in. Condorcet, who was the great supporter of the French Revolution, could not understand why there was this separation of powers, and not even when at the end of his life he was arbitrarily thrown into prison, where he continued to write about why the Americans have this separation of powers. And of course, if there had been a separation of powers, he wouldn't be rotting in prison.
Right, right. Could I just, you've got France is the unconstrained vision, 18th century America is the constrained vision, founding fathers the constrained vision. Could I ask if it goes even farther back? What comes to mind is Karl Popper's The Open Society and Its Enemies. There's a famous chapter in there in which he contrasts Plato, whom he views as a radical, the man who wants rule by the philosopher kings, with Aristotle, whom he views as a kind of piecemeal reformer. What you get in Plato is the impulse to start anew, and what you get in Aristotle is the impulse to accept the givenness of things and make one change, see how it works, another change, see how it works. In other words, I guess what I'm getting at is there some sense in which these two visions can be traced all the way through the Western tradition?
Oh, absolutely.
That's right.
Absolutely.
That's a fair statement.
Yes.
All right. Now, in this country, you talked about France versus the United States, but what about Americans versus Americans? John Adams versus Thomas Jefferson, for example? Is that a fair contrast? Adams would be constrained, Jefferson unconstrained?
To some extent, yes. Jefferson, when the complaint was made about the people who were innocent people killed during the course of the French Revolution, he said that I would rather that half the world be destroyed than that it should fail. But of course, as it went on, Jefferson backed away, and he did turn ultimately against it.
All right. So what you get...
He had a more unconstrained vision, but not totally.
Because what I'd like to do now is turn to these two visions as they play out in contemporary American politics. But before I do that, I want to make sure I understand you. Your vision is that the founding fathers, the fundamental institutions of the United States, reflect the constrained vision.
Absolutely.
And that therefore what you get within the American tradition is degrees of the constrained or the unconstrained vision. You don't get clean, sharp disagreements, or is that untrue?
Oh, you do get it. The whole erosion of the Constitution, largely by the courts, is the notion that no, we have to look out for the public interest, and therefore we won't worry about the constraints of the Constitution as much as some people would like.
All right, which takes us to segment two visions of the law. The constrained vision of the law, and here I quote A Conflict of Visions. Oliver Wendell Holmes expressed it when he declared, "The life of the law has not been logic, it has been experience," close quote.
Yes.
How is he giving expression to the constrained vision?
There is no one who, from sheer intellectual power, can tell you what the law ought to be, that we learn from trial and error simply because we're not capable of learning everything just by figuring it all out in advance.
The unconstrained vision of the law. Here you quote John Stuart Mill, quote, "To look at legal precedents was," I'm quoting you, "in Mill's view to make," and here you quote Mill, "an absurd sacrifice of present ends to antiquated means."
Yes.
Close quote. How is he giving voice to the unconstrained
Well,
vision?
this is the notion that we need someone to come along and update the law from his own intellectual resources rather than from the actual experience of millions of people in generation after generation. No one believes the law should remain fixed as it was at some given point in the past. The question is, who shall have the authority to change that law, and with what constraints on that person, so that that person is not just giving vent to his own feelings or imaginings or theories.
All right, let me give you a couple of quotations. John McCain, in the presidential debate of October 16th, on the kinds of judges he would nominate to the Supreme Court, quote, "I will find the best people in the United States of America who have a history of strict adherence to the Constitution and not legislating from the bench," close quote. Barack Obama, during the same debate, "If a woman is out there trying to raise a family, trying to support her family, and is being treated unfairly, then the court has to stand up if nobody else will. And that's the kind of judge I want."
That's
Close
unconstrained. That somehow or other there are people with the judicial robes on who can just decide these things ad hoc, which among other things would mean we would no longer really have law. You would discover, once you got into the courtroom in front of the judge, you would then discover what the decision is, but you'd have no clue beforehand.
So that would, a full embrace of the unconstrained vision, which Barack Obama seems intent on, would overturn the fundamental basis of American law, which is a nation of laws, not of men. It
Absolutely.
would be a nation of men, of judges.
Yes.
All right. September of this year, the Rasmussen Polling Company asked this question: should the Supreme Court make decisions based on what's written in the Constitution and legal precedents, or should it be guided mostly by a sense of fairness and justice? Close quote. 82% of McCain supporters said the Supreme Court should base its decisions on the Constitution. 29% of Obama supporters agree. 11% of McCain supporters said the Supreme Court should make its decisions on fairness. 49% of Obama supporters said that it should. Now, here's the question. You've said McCain constrained, Obama unconstrained. But what this would seem to indicate, this polling data, that this is not just a debate taking place among politicians or American elites. It's reached very deep into the American public.
Oh, absolutely.
49% of Americans think the Supreme Court should...
Of Obama supporters.
49% of Obama supporters, exactly, say so does that startle you? Does it alarm you?
It doesn't startle me, it depresses me. But, this has been going on for a long time. People complain about a court decision on the basis that, that they wish it had turned out differently. But that isn't the judge's job. There was a wonderful case, and I wish I could remember the title of it, which Clarence Thomas said that he really agreed with the position taken by one of the litigants in the case, but that he wasn't there to decide that issue. He was there to decide what did the law say, and the law said otherwise, and so he voted against them. You see the same thing in Oliver Wendell Holmes, where in a number of cases he makes very cutting disparagements of one of the litigants in the case, and then votes in favor of him because I'm not here to decide what the merit is. And one of his decisions, he said, I am not at liberty to discuss the justice of the act. The act is what it is, and once I know what that is, that's the decision I have to make.
Well, then, if you see, well, one more question here. You write, the unconstrained vision, again I'm quoting you, has tended historically toward creating more equalized economic and social conditions in society, even if the means chosen imply great inequality in the right to decide such issues and choose such means, close quote. Inequality in the right to decide issues. Does that tell us why the left in the United States seems so much more comfortable with having courts make social policy?
Oh, absolutely.
That's what's going on.
Absolutely. That they want equality of outcomes, and they will choose how to make the outcomes equal. But they don't want equality of choice on the part of the people themselves. Many of the liberals say that they're for the family because they're for creating all kinds of goodies to give to families, but they want to take away the family's fundamental function, which is making decisions for members of the family itself, particularly the younger members who aren't yet grown.
In the current political context, and we're taping this program just 2 weeks before the election, how do you see, what opportunity is there for those who believe in the constrained vision as regards the law to advance their view, to advance the constrained vision and beat back the unconstrained vision?
I guess you argue for it, as you do for other things, but I think what happens is that many people vote. They don't think that far ahead. They think, I like this guy, and so on. They don't think, what kind of judges will he be putting on the court, on the federal bench, who will be there 20 and 30 years from now, who will be turning loose criminals, let's say, for 20 or 30 years. Right.
Well, I know that you have some reservations about John McCain as a candidate, and we'll come to some of those, I suspect.
Yes.
Actually, I've got some questions intentionally to provoke you, Dr. Sowell. But would you say that on this issue alone, that the next president is likely to be able to nominate 2 or 3 justices to the Supreme Court?
Oh, absolutely.
That's decisive for you.
Yes.
All right. Okay. Segment 3, 2 visions of war. The constrained vision, and again, I'm quoting from your book, A Conflict of Visions. War is seen as originating in human nature and being contained by institutions. The unconstrained vision. Those with the unconstrained vision tend to explain war in terms of either misunderstandings or of hostile or paranoid emotions raised to such a pitch as to override rationality.
Yes.
Is it fair to say that the constrained vision is not surprised by war, but the unconstrained vision is always a little startled when a war breaks out?
Oh, absolutely. That you can take this back to the Federalists, where they said, why do we think that the 13 colonies will make war on each other if they're not united? And the answer was because that's what countries have always done. And so it's not a question of, in fact, it's not just war, it's poverty, it's crime. All those are things which people with the unconstrained vision feel needs explaining. Whereas people with a constrained vision think what needs explaining is how do we sustain peace? How do we have law and order? How do we have morality?
How would you interpret then, I can't remember whether Robert Kennedy was quoting someone else or whether this was original to him or to his speechwriters. The quotation is something like, some see the world and ask why. I see what could be and ask why not.
Yes, yes.
That's a kind of that's the unconstrained vision in a nutshell.
Absolutely.
All right. John McCain in February 2003, quote, this is the constrained and unconstrained vision as they apply to the question of warfare. In this age, liberating oppressed peoples from tyranny, from the tyranny of those who would do us harm, serves not only narrow national interests, but the ordered progress of freedom, close quote. Barack Obama in August of last year, quote, in the first 100 days of my administration, I will travel to a major Islamic forum and deliver an address to redefine our struggle. I will make clear that we will stand with those who are willing to stand up for their future and that we need their efforts to defeat the prophets of hate and violence. Close quote. What do you make of those two?
I think Barack Obama has a lot more faith in verbal interactions than I would.
That's the unconstrained vision.
Oh, absolutely. You see, well, what he's proposing under the guise of change is what has been tried for 2 decades between the two world wars, and which failed disastrously in helping to bring on the Second World War.
Well, that brings up another point. Is it fair to say that the constrained vision is more aware of history? That somehow or other there's an appreciation of and even a hunger for historical understanding, searching for precedent, what has worked before. Most things won't work. Therefore, we must work especially hard to discover what has worked in the past. And in the unconstrained vision, is there something, you don't say this in the book, this is a question on which I'm taking a total flyer here, but is there something almost anti-intellectual about the unconstrained vision, an unwillingness to look at the large facts of history?
There's an unwillingness to look at the facts of history, and it's anti-intellectual in the sense of intellectual processes. Unfortunately, it's all too characteristic of intellectuals as an occupational category. Between the two world wars, it was the leading intellectuals of the Western world who talked the biggest nonsense. I mean, it was Bertrand Russell who said that Britain should disarm, while Hitler was building up this military machine across the Channel. And in France as well, and Russell was by no means the only one in England.
So why? Why would the unconstrained vision prove so particularly appealing to intellectuals? I think we could say, if I said to you, what would you expect a survey of the faculties of the top 100 academic institutions in the United States to show? If we could come up with a set of questions that would show whether the faculty adhere to the constrained or the unconstrained vision, you and I would both expect a huge majority to subscribe to the unconstrained.
Oh, absolutely.
Vision, right? How come? Why? Why is that appealing to intellectuals?
That is a tough one. But I think that, I guess the short answer is they imagine that good people like themselves can make this thing go. And if it hasn't worked in the past, it's only because they haven't had the right people doing it. In other words, communism would have worked if it hadn't been for Stalin. But of course, once you have a system like communism, people like Stalin are the ones who will come to the fore.
All right. Back to warfare and defense. Barack Obama's plan for defense spending as of last year, I'm quoting his speech, I'll stop spending $9 billion a month in Iraq. I will cut tens of billions in wasteful spending. I will cut investments in unproven missile defense systems. I will not weaponize space. I will slow our development of future combat systems, and I will institute an independent defense priorities board to avoid unnecessary spending, close quote.
Well, that's straight out of the 30s. There were people who were saying Britain should not. The British Labour Party in the early to mid-30s voted consistently against defense spending, and they argued that our security does not depend on armaments, but on disarmaments. And so when Chamberlain went to Munich to talk to Hitler, it wasn't just his own party, the conservatives, who applauded him when he came back. It was the labor and liberals as well. He was probably the most lionized man among Western leaders, perhaps, of the past century.
John McCain, you've just compared Barack Obama to Chamberlain. I'm going to see if I can get you to compare John McCain to Churchill. How's that?
That a little bit harder, but go ahead.
All right, I'll take a shot at it. John McCain. It's very hard to find, at least I found it hard to find, an elaborated defense spending plan in McCain's website and campaign proposal. But he has at least at one point advocated an across-the-board federal spending freeze, but accepted defense spending from that freeze. And he would also, this is a quotation from a recent speech, increase the size of the U.S. Army and Marine Corps from the currently planned level of roughly 750,000 troops to 900,000 troops, close quote. So what you get in John McCain, this I think is fair to say, even if I can't find a specific proposal to get you to comment on, the notion that here's federal spending and here's defense spending. And it occupies, because it must, a privileged position within the structure of federal spending. What do you make of that?
Well, I think he recognized that you have to survive before you do anything else.
All right. So that strikes you as just good common sense.
Yes.
And McCain doesn't strike you as too belligerent?
Defending yourself is not belligerent.
All right. All right. Two visions of the economy. Again, I'm going to begin by quoting from A Conflict of Visions. The constrained vision sees market economies as responsive to systemic forces, the interaction of innumerable individual choices and performances. The unconstrained vision argues that this is not how the economy operates, that it is currently obeying the power of particular interests and should therefore be made in future to obey the power of the public interest.
Yes.
Close quote. Explain that.
Well, they imagine that they can define the public interest by themselves. Whereas in a market, each individual defines his own interests himself and acts accordingly and interacting with other people and accommodating other people and competing with other people.
All right. A couple of quotations here. This time I'm not going to contrast McCain with Obama. I'm going to begin with a quotation. Here it is. We who live in free market societies believe that growth, prosperity, and ultimately human fulfillment are created from the bottom up, not the government down. Let our banner proclaim our belief in a free market as the greatest provider for the people, close quote. Ronald Reagan.
Yes, I thought so.
You did, all right. Now, John McCain on September 15th. The American people are being threatened today because of greed and corruption that some engaged in on Wall Street and that we have got to fix, close quote. What do you make of what's going on in the Republican Party?
Well,
from Reagan to McCain.
Decline. When people ask me why am I going to vote for McCain rather than Obama, it's because I prefer disaster to catastrophe.
All right. You're not supposed to throw things at me from which I have to use valuable time to recover, Tom. All right. And here, listen to an exchange between Barack Obama and Joe Wurzelbacher, now known universally as Joe the Plumber. This took place on October 11th. Joe the Plumber. Your new tax plan is going to tax me more, isn't it? Barack Obama. It's not that I want to punish your success. I just want to make sure that everybody who's behind you, that they've got a chance to success too. I think when you spread the wealth around, it's good for everybody. Close quote. What do you make of that one?
Oh, I think it's classic left ideology. And by the way, he wants to spread Joe the Plumber's wealth around. He's not spreading his wealth around. We all know about his half-brother in Africa who is living in dire poverty. It's been fascinating to me, these various people who want to spend the taxpayers' money, but who, when it comes to charitable giving and so forth on their own, have no idea of doing that. I don't know if you're familiar with the study that's been done of liberals and conservatives donating money and giving time as volunteers and donating blood and so on. And contrary to what everybody expected, the conservatives do more of all of those things. The study showed that if everyone donated blood at the same rate at which conservatives donate blood, there'd be 45% more blood donated in the United States than there is.
And also, weren't you struck by the Joe Biden's tax forms when they were released? He's had an income that's roughly triple that of Sarah Palin, and yet his charitable contributions have been much smaller. Much smaller
absolutely,
than hers.
absolutely.
Right. Let me ask you, let me try with John McCain one more time. Two assertions he made in the very same 5-minute radio talk. This is both come from Radio Talk on October 18th. Quote, "At least in Europe, the socialist leaders who so admire my opponent are upfront about their objectives. Raising taxes on some in order to give checks to others is not a tax cut. It's just another government giveaway." Close quote. Excuse me, this is not from the radio talk, but it's from a rally he gave on the same day. And he was talking about the need to address the financial crisis by buying up mortgages. Quote, "We need to give you a mortgage that you can afford so you can realize the American dream of owning your home." Close quote. So which vision does John McCain represent?
He represents whichever one occurs there at the moment.
All right.
It's, he has what Thorstein Veblen called a versatility of convictions.
All right. But here's the argument. The argument would be, look, John McCain's in a tight spot. He's trailing. He's fundamentally the constrained vision. That is to say, he fundamentally supports free markets. And his record shows an overwhelming majority of the times where there's a vote in Congress that can be recorded as free market or anti-free market, he's on the free market side. He's maneuvering here. Be realistic, Tom Sowell. Politicians have to do that. Cut the man a little slack.
Well, if I were in his camp, perhaps I would say that. My job is not to cut him any slack. My job is to inform the people who read what I have to say.
All right. Back to Barack Obama. You mentioned the, I think you would call it a naive view of world affairs, that he places a great deal of faith in in rhetoric, the ability of rhetoric to solve global problems. This reminds you of the 1930s. It reminds you of Neville Chamberlain. I read you a quotation of the notion of spreading the wealth around, and again you said that's perfectly pure socialist doctrine from the 1930s. Would you argue that this man is the most left-wing or the purest embrace of the unconstrained vision that we've seen in American politics since when? Since the New Deal?
Since there's been American politics.
Really?
Yes. Yes. I mean, even FDR, pulled back on some things. But Obama really, he does have the unconstrained vision, which is really an elitist vision. It says, I know what is the best to be done, and I will do it. When he says, I will change the world, you realize this is a man who has actually accomplished nothing other than advancing his career through rhetoric. And it reminds me of a sophomore in college, who thinks that he can run the world because he's never had to run anything. And you can believe that only until you have personal responsibility for consequences. And that's when it gives you a little bit of humility.
Why don't the American people see through that? Isn't that the fundamental bet that the founders made, that that voters would see through, ultimately they'd see through nonsense?
Yes, but that was before nonsense became a large part of the curriculum of our educational institutions.
All right. Segment 5. The two visions and the nature of the campaign. Again, I begin by quoting from A Conflict of Visions. Those with a constrained vision have tended to be less concerned with promoting economic and social equality, but more concerned with the dangers of an inequality of power, producing an articulate, ruling elite of rationalists, close quote. That gets to Bill Buckley's famous quotation about he'd rather be ruled by the first 2,000 names in the Boston phone book than by the Harvard faculty. That's the point, right?
Yes.
If you perform a Google search on Obama plus the word professorial, you'll get more than 62,000 hits. What does that suggest to you? What's going on here?
We need to go to the phone book.
Where the wise, again, I'm quoting from A Conflict of Visions, where the wise and conscientious individual is conceived to be competent to shape outcomes directly. This is the unconstrained vision.
Yes.
I, Barack Obama, know what's best for you. This is the way you put it a moment ago. Then his sincerity is crucial. Sincerity is so central to an unconstrained vision that it is not readily conceded to adversaries, close quote.
That goes back at least 200 years. That people who have the constrained vision understand that people will make mistakes. And so therefore, when someone says something they disagree with, that to them is just one of the examples of it. They see no need to question his sincerity or honesty or whatever. But for those with the unconstrained vision, what they believe seems so obviously true that if you are standing in the way of it, either you must be incredibly stupid, utterly uninformed, or simply dishonest.
Let me read you a few of the terms that have been used to describe Sarah Palin. Liar, Andrew Sullivan. Cancer, David Brooks.
Oh, yes.
Jesus freak, Bill Mayer. Reactionary, Katha Pollitt. Zealot, Maureen Dowd. Is that part of what's going on here?
Yes, yes. People like that find it very hard to believe that someone else could honestly, sincerely, and intelligently reach a different conclusion. They talk about how complex the world is, but it never seems to be complex enough that other people could have read the same evidence they looked at and come up with a different conclusion.
Mm. The implicit visions, again, you write in your conclusion, divide controversialists at all levels and across the boundaries of the law, the economy, and the society, close quote. The constrained vision versus the unconstrained vision. How is an informed American to choose between those two visions?
I suppose it would require thinking about it, first of all, which is what a lot of people don't do anymore. I mean, there are people who simply react because they like the way someone sounds, and unfortunately, more and more such people vote.
So it's a question of education?
In one sense, yes. In another sense, no. I think before so many people went to colleges and universities, common sense was probably much more widespread.
Why is that? Why is that? Why is that? We keep coming back to higher education as a kind of pollutant in the American political system. That's been a theme of our conversation. Why? What's going on?
That's a tough one. That's my next book, which is about intellectuals.
Oh, really?
Yes, yes. But
what have you found? What conclusions have you reached so far?
That all the incentives are for people who are intellectuals in the sense in which I would define the term, to venture beyond what they are competent to do. That is, we know that who's the man at MIT who was the linguist? Noam Chomsky.
Oh, Noam Chomsky.
We know the man is a landmark figure in the study of linguistics.
Yes.
But we would never have heard of him if he stuck to linguistics.
True enough.
We know that our wonderful colleague, Mr. Ehrlich, is
Paul Ehrlich here at Stanford.
Yes, has a reputation in entomology. But we would never have heard of him if he had stuck to entomology. And so all the incentives are to go beyond what you're competent to deal with and to just assume that because you're wonderful at this, that this makes you sort of a general philosopher king.
All right. If the current polls hold, the Wall Street Journal, I'm quoting the Wall Street Journal now, declared in an editorial last week, Barack Obama will win the White House on November 4th, and Democrats will consolidate their congressional majorities. Though we doubt, most Americans realize it, the journal continues, this would be one of the most profound political and ideological shifts in U.S. history, close quote. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And the repercussions extend, the fact that they will create disasters in the economy, I think will pale by comparison to what they will do in terms of countries acquiring nuclear weapons and turning those over to terrorists, which is the point of no return once that happens.
Right, right. I was talking about this with a colleague of ours the other day, Tom McCurdy, who's an economist here at the Hoover Institution, and Tom said, well, remember what happened when Bill Clinton became president. His point is the American people are about to get an extreme illustration of the way government intervention messes things up. Bill Clinton offered only a mild illustration, and yet even under Bill Clinton, it was only 2 years before there was enough of a backlash response that Republicans took both houses of Congress away, and the man was boxed in from that point forward. That's a pretty optimistic reading of what might happen. In fact,
very
it's about
optimistic.
Very optimistic?
Yes, because there is such a thing as a point of no return. And if in those first 2 years Iran gets nuclear weapons, we will be at that point of no return. And the next generation will live under that same threat and as far out as the eye can see. And so, sometimes people who are very clever say it's just as well to let these guys get in there and discredit themselves. Then we'll win on the backlash. People said that when Hitler was arising in Germany, and many of those people who said that died in the concentration camps. Which is a smaller tragedy than a nation dying in a sense.
Before the primaries had ended, you wrote, Hillary Clinton versus John McCain. I wouldn't know whether to vote Libertarian or move to Australia. Now we know it's Barack Obama versus John McCain. You'll vote for John McCain, but hold your nose? What's your fundamental outlook?
Yes, the difference is the Clintons had the saving grace of utter lack of principle, which meant that when they saw which way the political winds were blowing, that's the way they'd go, regardless of what they'd been saying before. This man has been a far-left ideologue for 20 years. And not just a matter of ideology. I mean, people who are truly vile people. We're not talking about just people who have a certain theory.
Bill Ayers.
I mean, Acorn. I mean, we're talking thuggery as the way to get your ideas across. Father Flagel. You go down the list. I judge people by what they've done, not by what they say, particularly when what they say is the direct opposite of what they've done. So that, no, I think this man really does believe that he can change the world. And people like that are infinitely more dangerous than mere crooked politicians.
Final question. Let's suppose that the Wall Street Journal is right. Let's suppose that Barack Obama wins and that the Democrats increase their majorities in both the House and the Senate. Let's suppose all of that. What would be your advice to young people dedicated to free markets, individual liberty, and broadly speaking to the constrained vision that you write about in A Conflict of Visions? What do you do if something like this happens?
You do whatever you find you can do under those conditions, which you can only learn by experience. But it's a little like saying, what advice do you give to someone on death row when they come to take him down to the gas chamber?
Tom, I'm trying very hard here to find a question to end the show on an up, but I don't seem to. I don't seem to be succeeding.
Well, one good thing is that economists' predictions have been proven wrong before, and you can always hope that this one will be one of those many predictions.
All right. Dr. Thomas Sowell, author of A Conflict of Visions and author of the forthcoming second edition of another classic book you wrote, Applied Economics. This will be out in January.
Yes.
Dr. Thomas Sowell, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For Uncommon Knowledge, I'm Peter Robinson. Thanks for joining us.